a.m. But as I woke up with this dream that it was 6 a.m. and I had forgotten this. And I jumped out of the bed and it was 4 a.m. Anyway, oh, good morning, Magda. Good to see you. Grace. Oh, it's so wonderful to see how many of you are here. Helena, good morning.
Hi. It's 5 p.m. in China, so it's great.
5 p.m. So this is perfect time, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Good, good. Good morning, Manar. Well, I think we're going to get going. Maybe one more minute, right?
Yes.
Oh, you should have seen, Stefania, President Saleh sent the most beautiful message to the graduates, which we sent them last night. I will send you a copy of that. It's all about the theme that we're discussing, COVID, how it is impacting education, why leadership is key, and so on.
That's great.
And Felipe, I want to thank you and Seth and Laura for this wonderful help in organizing an amazing conference. Hey, Ertehal, good morning. What time is it in Egypt right now?
It's 11 a.m. So
11 a.m. So a very decent time.
Yeah, very well.
Mohammed, good morning. How are you? We are on mute, Mohammed.
Good morning, Professor.
And what time is it in Bangladesh?
3 p.m. So it's
3 p.m. So it's only an indecent time in Boston. For everyone else, this is very good.
I think so, Fernando.
All right, well, good. I'm glad it works for all of you. This is excellent. Well, I think we're going to get going. It is just a real pleasure to welcome you all. And I'm just so delighted to see so many of you at this conference. At the outset, I want to thank, of course, Andy Hall, who's with us, Felipe Correa Jaramillo. Where are you, Seth? You were here just a moment. Oh, Seth Layton here, and their colleague, Laura, who've done a remarkable job, essentially volunteering to helping us organize this awesome conference that is going to bring together 300 of you from all over the world. And I want to give a special thanks to Stefania Giannini, who is herself a university professor, a former university president, Minister of Education of Italy, and the most splendid director of education of UNESCO, who has really led the organization into seizing the moment and the need to make education not just equitable, but relevant. She is one of only 3 directors in the entire history of UNESCO to have appointed a commission to think about the future of education. And she must have had the gift of clairvoyance, because when she appointed this commission, of course, she couldn't think about COVID and what kind of impact this was going to have in education, essentially placing educational opportunities for poor children around the world at the risk of collapse. And I have really admired, Stefania, your leadership in making sure you bring the entire international development community together to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we don't lose all the gains made over the last several decades in opportunity. And I'm so appreciative. It speaks so much about your commitment to this enterprise that when I invited her to give the opening keynote of this conference of graduates of the program, she said, but of course. And so it's a real honor to have you open our conference. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming Stefania. Over to you, Stefania.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you, all our friends connected from many different places of the world. It's really a pleasure and honor to give this first keynote at the very early hour for the East Coast and more decent hours in other regions of the world, as in Paris, where I am now. And I understand that this is a bit the start of a global education marathon, right? So I'm happy to be the first to kick off a very interesting discussion and process. And the topic you proposed in this cycle of a conference in the program is leading global education through the pandemic and beyond. So I will focus on this topic, of course, but I suggest, if you don't mind, to make together through the next 40 minutes. I will talk to you an exercise which is about language. I will highlight in my speech some keywords that, in my opinion, we can keep as the keywords of this crisis so far. And I kindly ask all of you to take note, because this is my proposal about understanding the crisis and some lessons learned from the crisis. As you said, I'm a university professor and I'm a linguist as a background, classical philologist and linguist later. And I do believe that definitely everything which happens in history, can be summarized through language and some keywords. So I kindly ask you to do this exercise, and then we'll see in the Q&A session, which are other points of view and other proposals. So let me go straight to the point, education. Education has been definitely through a particle accelerator in the past 7 months. The shock to systems caused by school and university closures in more than 180 countries has no parallel since the establishment of the United Nations, has no parallel in history. So we should say that this is really an unprecedented situation. So my premise today is that while the ongoing pandemic increases by the day the risk of exclusion and learning loss with consequences that could stretch over decades, the crisis is generating transformation that could well be a long-needed turning point in the purpose and practice of education, and its perception as well and place in society. So the first 2 keywords I would like to highlight are exclusion. It was a word very common also before the pandemic, but I think now it has a new kind of place in the grammar for this century, unfortunately, and transformation. Such reflections have marked every period in humanity history. It's not a new kind of a situation somehow. From ancient Greece and Rome through the Middle Age, the Enlightenment and pedagogical innovation of the 20th century, and we can go straight to the massification of education over the past 70 years, especially the last 30 years. And its recognition as universal human right. I think that common good, education as a common good, is another key word which can immediately take from this crisis, as is the first time in history that all citizens, parents, families, not only teachers, educators, and specialists like we are supposed to be in this room today, realized the importance of education as a common good, as a basic human right, as they realize that schools can be shut down overnight because of something which enormous, which happened and which is outside the education sector. So let me go back to the question of a bit of history of the situation we are running. From these early 70s of last century, with the reports led by 2, outstanding personalities. First, Edgar Faure, former Minister of Education in France, and then Jacques Delors, former President of the European Commission. The organization I'm the honor to be part of, UNESCO, has already provided a kind of intellectual exercise. They organize the intellectual space for shaping the future of education, with the most recent initiative now launched last year, to which Professor Reimers brings really a great, unbelievable kind of inspiring expertise and the humanistic vision. Well, this kind of exercise is quite timely today because of the crisis, because of we anticipated a bit, a pioneering this need of going beyond the present. And the mandate of this commission, which is casting the net wide in the digital age to collect different views from all walks of life, has somehow, coincided, collided with a radically new landscape, a different educational reality. In many ways, the crisis has leveled recurrent debates of the past years. Either we talk of the relationship between teachers and technologies, or the conservatism of education systems and the need of radical change, on the self-interest of ed tech players, just to mention something which is very popular already, or was very popular already before the crisis. Everywhere, governments and partners have reacted swiftly to deploy distance learning solutions. And above all, we all witness the overarching value that education carries for individuals and societies. So, other two keywords I would like to highlight are inequalities and the need of transformation. Children, what we can see, what we could see over the last 5-6 months, more or less, from the UNESCO Global Observatory. Oh, really? We see children climbing up trees to capture an internet signal to access their courses, because connectivity, as we know, is not reaching everybody everywhere. We could see teachers checking up individually on students, assuring not only connection and being part of a new virtual room, but really taking care of their students and taking care of the human side of teaching or learning. And we could see, this is a very new entry somehow, parents and caregivers providing daily support and being part of the learning process and the teaching process as well, and giving or trying to give motivation to keep children learning. So the education community somehow has been obliged to open doors to a new kind of key players and making this a time ripe to reform and reimagining. Other two keywords I would like to put in our book note this morning are for sure reforming and reimagining. At a time when the world has been growing more unequal, we've witnessed the devastating impact of inequalities on learning. And this applies universally in the global north and in the global south as well. It's estimated that for the first, since its conception, the Human Development Index, for sure what I'm referring to, of which the education dimension accounts for a third, will show a striking decline. We don't have yet precise data, but we are already discussing very much with the World Bank and our colleagues about this dimension of the crisis. Children and youth have been more exposed, of course, to different kind of problems they already ran before: violence, including gender-based violence, missing out learning altogether because of poverty, conflict and crisis, lack of access to technology, disability, language, geography, and I can go ahead. So still increasing inequalities, I already mentioned this keyword, increasing now inequalities is another lessons learned, is another keyword to understand the process we are running. Now let me dedicate a few minutes to go through a short chronology of this crisis, of course, putting the education lens on that. And let me start with the very beginning. In early February, a member of my team, to put it very simply, urged that we post a story on school closures in China. It was the first country, you remember, to decide on that. And measures taken to switch the world's largest education system into online mode to reach some 200 million primary and secondary students and their teachers at country level. The experiment quickly took on a global scale. It was really like a fast track process of school closures from east to west. In early March, I remember clearly, it was about 10 March. UNESCO came out with our first mapping of school closures affecting 300 million students. A few weeks later, the figure had climbed to over 1 billion. And at the peak, you remember, is a number that many big media repeated many times. We reached our peak in education, which was 1.6 billion students. So no system was prepared, of course, for such a shock and for the new territory into which education was suddenly propelled. And education ministers and governments, started to express their deep need of first sharing information, looking at other good practices or some new solutions put in practice in other countries. I remember they really, in a short notice, rallied to meetings, webinars we hosted to learn from each other. This is was about how to set up distance learning platforms. From that moment, we can say that through three months mostly, education systems relied on distance learning platforms or what we call hybrid learning systems, which means using more traditional education channels like radio, TV, and giving solutions according to the context. One size for all didn't work from the very beginning. So UN agencies, and this is another interesting point I would like to highlight, came together rapidly and tried to support countries with policy guidance, emergency resources, and technical backing. So another key word I want to highlight about the crisis and the impact of the crisis on education is really partnership. A new kind of partnership, a new kind of urgent need of working together differently, thinking and acting differently from the past is something we learn as a natural process. We mentioned agility many times. It's a word that you more for sure refer to private sector companies, which has the urgency of deliver, and you don't really refer agility to the UN systems and the big organization. I should say that the crisis put the system in a startup mood and in an agile exercise. As institutions, we were as confronted as education system with the need to be disruptive in order to protect the right to education. This is not a new keyword. Of course, the right to education, as you know, goes back to the 1960 convention on this basic principle. Fernando Reimers is one of the most outstanding specialists who can say very much more than me about this specific topic. But I can say that the new kind of framework we are moving on, I can mention the Global Education Coalition that UNESCO established in March, and now it's a platform, putting together in the same virtual room 150 partners from private sector, UN organizations, civil society, university, and so on. So I can mention the great job Harvard University with OECD did from the very beginning in order to monitor the quality impact of the crisis. I mean, it's a big system of partnership coming together to support education community all over the world. But let me say that interventions range from different kind of layers we never explored together before, from expanding access to the distance learning platform, to training teachers to use them, to digitizing curricula in the different way, to producing community, as I mentioned before, radio content, or equipping youth with digital skills, align in a short time, of course, align different sets of partners each time. So what we are doing still is about to join forces with a multilateral and other global organization in a campaign. We call it Save Our Future, and it's about warning of the dangers of sidelining education in the recovery. So advocacy is another key word, which is not a new word as well, but which came with a new sense of urgency as well, and being part of our common mission in the coming weeks and months. I will say something later about that. Now, where we are now, we are at a crossroads. Let me say, put it very simply. We are at a crossroads as the time has come to switch out of the emergency mode that definitely has defined the past 7 months from early February, as I mentioned, to trace the way forward, because the world in which education unfolds has durably changed, and because there are very high risks in front of us. The massive efforts made in a short time to respond to the shocks to education systems remind us that changes previously considered difficult or sometimes really impossible to implement now are possible. It's something which is in our hands and which is in political leaders and political decision makers' hands. Our campus remains the most ambitious, it's about SDG 4. It's about giving quality, inclusive education to all children in the next 10 years. This leaves 1 decade, which the UN has huge B1 of action. This will require keeping lessons learned from this crisis, a real transformational change. This requires disruption, innovation, commitment. Let me keep 2 keywords from this part of the vocabulary I'm proposing to you this morning. Disruption and innovation. Of course, they are not new entry in the last century vocabulary, but somehow they're becoming new entry in the education systems vocabulary, which is not so used to rethink the system in a disruptive way with a sense of urgency and a sense of delivery, not in a one-size-for-all, but looking at a more personalized track and context-oriented approach. Well, the pandemic is a exacerbated crisis that we are already battling. You know numbers. I don't want you to go through all numbers we had in our agenda. Almost 260 million children and youth out of the school, 50% of students not acquiring basic competencies, literacy, numeracy, after several years of training, and over 700 million adult illiterate still. But the crisis amplified dramatically these numbers. Let me have a look really quickly at the most salient facts and figures as a quick reminder. And let me keep as a summary of this part of my presentation another keyword we keep from this crisis back, which is the importance of data and figures. We realized from the very beginning that without a monitoring process, evidence-based, we couldn't approach this crisis with a sense of collective action and results-oriented solutions we need. So I already mentioned 1.6 billion students affected in over 180 countries. Today, as we are talking about education, schools remain closed at national level in over 50 countries, and it's about affecting about 800, more or less, million students. Approximately 1/3 of students had no access still to remote learning during the pandemic. So as an average, half of teachers lacked the basic digital skills to manage online learning. So you see that the digital divide had an impact on this crisis as well, of course. Since the onset of the pandemic, students have lost an average of 60 days of schooling in their academic year. And today we know that nearly, these are our projections, of course, these are not real data, they are projections, but I think very reliable ones. Nearly 24 million children and youth from pre-primary to tertiary level of education, university level, are now at risk of dropout this year, not going back to school because of the crisis. And this includes 11 million girls. So it's telling that the steepest declines are at the pre-primary and the higher education levels. And this is an interesting data. The earliest years when education has a critical role. This is about the neurosciences clearly demonstrating that what you learn from 0 to 3 is somehow what you have in your mind, what is shaping your approach to learning for the rest of your life. And the more senior ones, university level, that groom qualifications and career choices and much more than this. So this is a future that is really very much fragile, more than before, and very much uncertain, more than before. Fragility and uncertainty are the two keywords I would like to take in my small vocabulary. So doors of opportunity are shutting at all levels. The job outlook is grim, with youth and high risk of that. And governments everywhere, we can see now really, are juggling with the pandemic resurging. Here in Europe, I'm talking to you from Paris, from France. We are waiting on Monday from government to announce possibly new restriction, new several measures. And we see a situation which is still in the first wave. So we are not beyond, we are still in the crisis. And moreover, there is evidence that in the economic downturn, which is the other sector, economy as a big sector, which is already living in a very impactful situation from this crisis. Domestic education budgets are at risk, to be squeezed. Education will face stiff competition from other sectors. Fiscal space will be reduced, and aid to education will shrink possibly. Even if the budget share of education remains stable, this is another interesting number I want to tell you, public education spending may be 8% lower this year, 2020. And this is a dramatic projection. School closures are projected to increase the annual funding gap for education in poorer countries to as much as $200 billion a year. I can remind you to another number about the gap, the year gap we calculated before this crisis, and it was around $39 billion a year. So you can see the difference. And you have outlined these challenges, Fernando, in this volume that is of the press so fast on leading education through COVID-19. And I'm sure that these numbers will be part of the public debate and discussion in the coming weeks as the governments and parliaments are deciding on recovery funds and the stimulus package to be allocated somehow. And I want to mention also the policy brief issued in early August and coordinated also by the way, as penholder by UNESCO from the UN Secretary General team. And Guterres himself warned that without urgent action, we are at risk of a generational catastrophe that could waste untold human potential and also erase decades of progress. So this is a dramatic language, but it's not about simply keeping alert and warning and shaking the world. It's about really data, evidence-based reflections on the impact of the crisis, going through the economic dimension and all the other, I try to summarize a bit today. So what we are doing now, what can we do now, which are the main action to be taken? And, I'm sure that in this heroic, sleepless room audience today in the East Coast for sure, and international audience composed by change makers who are at the frontiers of research and innovation policy. I think it's interesting to focus a bit on concrete actions and innovations we have to very, very quickly try to put in practice, to suggest governments to put in practice in the coming weeks. It's about recovery, it's about reimagining education, just a few words already mentioned before. There are high stakes choices to be made today to respect and expand the right to education and to put education at the very core, at the center of political agenda in this transitional phase from being at the very core still of the sanitary crisis, looking forward to the next step, which would be transition to recovery phase and keeping decision to building back better, as you usually say. This starts, in my opinion, with a set of immediate actions that are nonetheless embedded in a societal vision. It's not just post-recovery, COVID, unfortunately. It's about drawing some lessons from this global experience that has affected every community, exposing the extent of our interdependence with each other and nature and the value of a common public goods, namely the right to health and the right to education, are the two key words I would like to put in practice. Because beyond solving a crisis, this is a time for deep reflection on the substance of learning, particularly as we struggle against the denial of scientific knowledge and actively fight misinformation, misunderstanding, and the Futures of Education Commission recently warned in these 9 ideas for the future of education. I kindly suggest you have a look. Well, the first action that was prioritized by the Secretary General himself is to get students back into schools, a learning institution as safely as possible. The longer schools remain closed, the more devastating the impact. It's a very simple equation that we cannot avoid to recall today, especially on the poorest and vulnerable children, and this applies in every country. It is the first global education crisis we had in history. Schools are also community spaces that offer social protection, health, nutrition. As I already said this morning, we are not there yet. We'll not delve into detail on health and hygiene protocols, reduce class sizes and blended learning, but emphasize 3 dimensions that are transformative musts. Inclusion should be the gold standard. It's not the case yet. It's a very broad concept. Inclusion is not simply to be applied in this context, but inclusion now is a culture that recognizes diversity and works with it as a fabric for making our society more cohesive and just. And let me define it like this. Inclusion is the yardstick of recovery. Millions of children and youth continue to miss out or cut short the education journey well before completing the basic cycle. Building back more resilient means creating the conditions and the environments where all children are treated with dignity and learn regardless of identity, background, ability. And this is a very tough goal. It requires measures to target those most in need, teaching to fulfill every learner's potential, leadership to combat discrimination, create a sense of belonging, and make diversity as a force. As schools reopen, this is a time to invest in early intervention in those forces behind and in those who are at risk of never returning to school, in general responsive measures and in support to the teaching profession. I think this is the very first set of immediate action needed. Second point, it's about teachers and valorizing the teaching profession. I cannot tell you that this is a new entry in the grammar of education and educators, education specialists and educators is not neither a new entry in policy guidance for education ministers as well. But as this Monday, next Monday, marks the World Teachers' Day, as every year, will try to put teachers under the spotlight and try to focus on the real added value of this profession. I think that it's a special kind of celebration this year. A resilient educational recovery is one of co-created with teachers, and we cannot avoid this year to highlight this key word, teaching and teachers, as a critical part of the system in the coming months. And this has a lot of implications for governments and policymakers. It's about taking care of that training and keeping teachers training as a mandatory policy at national level. I can tell you from my personal experience as former minister through the years in my country recently to 2014 February and the end of almost 3 years and the end of 16, it's not an easy job to be done because it's a very costly policy, expensive policy, and it's a very strong discussion with unions, which must be part of the solution and not become an obstacle to this or this important action. But today, this discussion and this action is no more about, let me say, political games between government and opposition between government and unions, between government and teachers community and their representatives is a must, is one of the must to be put at the core of the political agenda in the coming months. International found that more often than not, they were not consulted on learning modalities. We had to take into account their reflections. To be better, the role of teachers must be recognized, enhanced, and teachers and their representatives must be part of the process and not simply informed on the process. Especially now, more than ever, this is a very much needed kind of new approach. Third point and third action to be taken is about, of course, I cannot avoid to focus on that, technology and connectivity. But it's not a new entry as well. You say technology for education, ICT in education. When I joined UNESCO, I found one of the strongest unit in my team, and the mission to transform education was ICT in education. But there are some changes now because of this crisis and thanks to this crisis. Let me put it like this. The third transformative dimension we see is a new kind of role of technology in education. It's no more as an add-on, but it's now a must-have. I hope I can say something like this summarizes in English. Built into systems to improve learning, pedagogies, training, and resilience to crisis. I think we have to move from a more mechanical vision of technology, focusing very much on infrastructures and role of infrastructures in the classroom and role of infrastructures to build a new kind of classroom, the virtual ones, a very good example, to a new, how can I say, AI-based and transformative technology, this century setting that is no more the ancient century one. Let me explain a bit more about that. I think that what we learned in these last 6 months is that educational opportunity has become heavily dependent on connectivity, on digital connectivity. And we learned that connectivity increasingly supports essential services. This is a matter of fact. But what we still need, and this is the job to be done in the coming months, is about putting in practice inclusive policy in teaching and learning based on connectivity and e-learning and distance learning methodologies. And inclusive policies must therefore strengthen the digital infrastructure of education at all levels, and on the other side, as a nice guy, Sim T. Berners-Lee, I'm sure you remember, he was the founder, a bit the inventor somehow of the World Wide Web at CERN more than 30 years ago, recently called for a global push to connect everyone, observing that, I'm quoting, the web is a lifeline in this crisis, and yet it's a lifeline denied to billions just when they needed it most. So it's about a new kind of right to connectivity, to be inclusive, and to be not simply thought as infrastructures based. The Futures of Education Commission I mentioned before, established and kicked off last year at UNESCO, where Fernando is an outstanding member of, calls for a broadening of the right to education to encompass the right to connectivity. I'm not sure that will be so good, so and so powerful. So through moral suasion, to data collection, to convince governments and member states to rethink a bit the framework of right to education in the coming months, maybe some years needed, to rethink the concept of right to education, including a new inclusive concept of connectivity for education, but ensure that UNESCO will do its job. And we start with a simple action now in the coming months. It's about launching the Lifelines to Learning initiative, which is about preparing the ground for a declaration on connectivity for education. Of course, it's something that member states has to take in terms of ownership, in terms of commitment. But I think it's important to highlight these new keywords, which are about right education, including inclusive connectivity in the coming months and years. To sum up, a resilient recovery, whether learning happens online, in person, or in a mixed blended mode, calls in every context for an inclusive ethos, let me say like this, to build back equal, to valorize teacher, and to make equitable connectivity and technologies for learning. This is a bit the picture and the sum up. Well, this kind of very ambitious and uncertain landscape will oblige education systems everywhere to become more flexible, to become more open, to become more agile. We learned that schools are a real pillar. We also knew before, but now we realize the schools are a nucleus in communities, places that provide not only learning, critical learning, first learning, but also essential services, social relationships to be founded, established from the very beginning of childhood, where diversity is encountered, where the grammar of dialogue, learning to lie together happens, and this cannot be replaced. But what can be envisioned is a more fluid learning landscape in different spaces, maybe, in different time, maybe. So the more traditional, and very consolidated coordinates, space and time, have to be put under discussion, and maybe something that our Futures of Education Commission will deliver in 1 year in their report will be, I don't know, their job, not my job, but maybe they will focus a bit on that as well. Well, I think time is really running, so I'm going really to some conclusion, and let me focus on the transformative dimension of learning itself we need it now for education, for society, and sustainability. The mental health and well-being of children has been endangered, for sure, in ways that could have lasting repercussions, not only in the immediate future, but for maybe years or decades. Maybe you heard the Save the Children survey just released. It's about over 6,000 children and parents in 5 developed countries, including the US, which reveals that almost 1 in 4 children are dealing with feelings of anxiety, and many at risk of depression. It's time to mainstream these social-emotional skills in education systems. It's time to put, in practice a new well-being system around learning and teaching and around education. As the physical frontiers of our lives diminished, the relationship to learning, work, and after leisure turned virtual, connecting us to an unprecedented degree, revealing spontaneous initiative to break isolation and meet basic human needs. Well, yet I'm reading and also raising up new kind of misinformation and intolerance. And I think all these kind of consequences are really becoming another part of the legacy that this crisis is bringing out. And these are some other keywords I would like to put in my vocabulary. So to conclude, what do we need now? What education need now? The transformation of education requires new knowledge, for sure, requires fresh evidence, and required a new kind of courage to question established beliefs, practices, and to be able to experiment. I think there are very good conditions to do that. We are in the better way, in the better set to provide the intellectual infrastructure for this transition to happen. Let me go back to my real position, and I love so much, really, but to my life job, which is being a classical philosophy and a philologist, and a linguist, as I said, and conclude to go back to another critical word, crisis. As you know, crisis comes from ancient Greek. The verb is krino and means judge, separate, distinguish, and choosing. So crisis means to have the opportunity of separating, of distinguishing, and choosing. I really hope and am sure that the next coming weeks and months will be about making the right choices on the basis of better knowledge and better evidence and a lot of empowerment that this crisis brought to all of us. I thank you very much.
Stefania, thank you so very much for this wonderful opening keynote, giving us a new lexicon, a new vocabulary. And as you said, terms are very important because they are the foundation of how we make sense of the world. They are the foundation of organized thought, and we need a new language to make sense of this crisis. I'm going to invite all of you to use the chat room to post any questions. I don't know that we're going to have time for all of them. And then raise your hand. I may call on some of you, but this way we can get more of you to write some questions. So if you would raise your hand, I will call on you. And you're also welcome to use the chat function and compose your thoughts there. And maybe I think we have Stefania for another 5 minutes or so. But this was just terrific. Liana, you go first.
Thanks, Fernando. And Stefania, that was just like such a wonderful way to open this conference and really framing not just with a new vocabulary, but with a challenge about choice in crisis. I really appreciated that so much. One of the things we were hearing, lots of data coming out about the impact on learners, folks starting to look at learning loss, the huge number of students impacted by this. And one of the things that we're hearing less about, and I just wanted to ask about, is really what kind of toll we foresee this crisis taking on the teaching force. So we know with higher education institutions closing in some instances, so the pipeline for new teacher training programs maybe slowing down or halting, and if there's been any look at teachers possibly choosing to leave the teaching force to work in other areas with schools closed down or other things. If you have any thoughts on that, thank you.
I can take this one, Fernando. You want to collect some of the questions?
Why don't we get 3 of you, and then we give you a chance to respond. Let's get 2 more. Manar.
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you, Ms. Giannini, for this inspirational note. And thank you, Fernando, for organizing this and all the people who stand behind this great event. I have one question, or maybe I was just wondering, in the midst of all this, we realized that among the new partners, they're not really new, but parents and caregivers at home, the role of the heroic role of all the families, all the parents that they did throughout this time supporting students, it's really obvious that they are partners in this process. And I was wondering if among all the resources for supporting teachers and also supporting technology, it's good to look at their role as partners and how to better support them in this process, how to better make them, like when we talk about inclusion, I know the meaning is different, but I'm just saying that maybe it's time to think of parents as real partners for real educators, and maybe look for like allocating more support towards families and parents.
Thank you, Luciana. You get the next question.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a very specific but I think tough question. Is you invited us, like the first thing you said, like we need to get students back in schools, especially vulnerable students. But these often come with a challenge that means bringing teachers back into schools, and in many countries, the teaching force has mostly older teachers, which are at risk for catching the virus. So this opens other challenges. So, for example, should we fast-pace other policies like bringing them out of the teaching force and giving them some benefits, like retirement policies, and fast-pacing other policies of bringing younger teachers into the teaching force. I think that's a challenge we're facing now, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we'll give you a chance to respond to these three, Stefania.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. I try to go briefly in order maybe to take some other questions. Thanks for all of you for reacting so important topics. Teachers. Well, let me say that I understand, and we could see also from a survey I mentioned that teachers didn't, as an average, worldwide, feel comfortable in terms of being prepared, feeling to be prepared to this jumping from a traditional classroom to virtual ones. 60 countries we covered, and 65% of teachers interviewed said we were not prepared to do that. On the other side, so what we can take as an indication, as a reflection from this situation, it's a fantastic, tremendous opportunity we have to really translate in concrete policies the valorization of teaching profession. We talk so much, let me say honestly, in many in many different contexts before this crisis. Concretely, teachers now need to be supported by a specific training to be made today, in the coming months. That's why I talk about recovery funds to be, and stimulus package to be, to include education with this specific chapter, in order to be really ready to face other challenges, not necessarily a second wave of a pandemic, but maybe some kind of new, changing landscape for education. Second point is about salaries, is about, valorizing the teaching profession, recognizing a social role and prestigious role that in many countries, unfortunately, declined. over last decades. And this is a good opportunity to do that, as we saw that without teachers keeping their own responsibility, the school system already shut down in many countries, didn't have any chance to assure continuity of learning. A third dimension is about protecting teachers. And I keep the last questions together, if I may. Let me say like this. It's possible to combine the right to education and the right to teaching, let me say, with the right to health. The guidelines that we published recently, UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, about reopening schools include a set of simple measures that can protect also older teachers in the classroom. It's up to governments now to take these guidelines and to translate in concrete actions, which principals in schools and the representatives of ministries on the ground must assure and provide. But this is very much possible. Health and education will be the two pillars for building better, and this includes to make teachers comfortable and safe in the classroom as children as well. Parents being part of the game, let me put it like this very simply. Well, what is the new, in my opinion, as I could observe worldwide, which is the new issue we can take from this crisis? It's about being directly implicated in the process and not simply being the counterpart of teachers in a separate time, in a separate space. I mentioned before, one of the real disruptive change I see in this crisis for education is putting under discussion space and time of schooling, and that means of teaching and learning. And that means that the community of educators now is no more composed by fixed roles and separated functions, teachers, parents, caregivers, and the community. Now we can see, like, let me go back to African say I love so much. To educate a child, it needs a village. To educate a child now, it really takes a global, interconnected village. Over to you.
Fernando, you're muted.
This was wonderful, Stefania. There are a couple of more questions, and I know we have gotten to the end of this session. I wonder if we could have you for 5 more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
So here are 3 quick questions. From a systems change perspective, there are new relations among actors and structures that now support education. What new paradigm is UNESCO trying to promote to enhance those relationships? That's one. Next one. When you talk about inclusive policy for connectivity, what do you think could be achieved as access to internet has high costs? Without funding, how can this be done? And then the last one, can you elaborate on why you predict that even if fiscal funding won't decrease, public schools could decrease funding by 8%? And then can you share a practice where you think that using artificial intelligence can be more transformational than using it more mechanically? So do what you can with those in 5 minutes. And as anyway, go ahead.
I'll try my best. I'll try my best, Fernando. So, new paradigm needed. Sorry, I'm just going ahead with my simple exercise, which can help to summarize a bit. The paradigm we need internationally is about being more than ever based on a better coordination between all the big players of the education international architecture, being transformative ourselves in order to become a game changer and transformative in society and in education systems. And let me say simply, thinking a bit out of the box, which is not an exercise that usually education systems at national level are familiar with, and international organizations as well. So I think that new kind of partnership, as I mentioned before, taking collective responsibility, and being really thinking out of the box oriented, a bit like in university we usually used to do, can become a new paradigm for education internationally. I think the point of inclusive policy from a specific angle, there may be more than this, but in the short time I have, I want to focus on one. Yes, connectivity is not for free. Connectivity is basically in the private sector hands, which is the added value of the new kind of inclusive partnership we try to build from the beginning of this crisis. UNESCO led the process, but also other organizations, of course, are part of this coalition. It's about asking the private sector, head tech, especially high-tech companies, to sit in the room, to take their own responsibility, to agree about some ethical principles like privacy, protection of data, and all this stuff, and to engage them in terms of their commitment to support countries about connectivity. Of course, there are companies, they are for profit, but I think it's a very important next step to go. Fiscal rules and budget. I really cannot go now in detail because it's a bit focusing on some numbers and keeping from angles that I don't have time to do that. If you're interested, we are really about publishing more data on this part of on this dimension. What I can say now is that our projections clearly say that even if governments will decide to stay where they are, there will be a decrease, a decline of funding for education. Either we talk of national domestic funding, which, by the way, I recall you, all of you, kindly, that covers 97% of the entire budget for education globally. Or we talk about international aid for cooperation. So the job to be done now is to call for commitment and action, leaders of the world at the highest level. That's why we are inviting them on the 22nd October in a global education meeting. Fernando, you'll be part of the job, of course, to say, yes, we want to put education as a pillar in our stimulus packages and recovery funds, and not leaving education as a sector behind. What can you do is that, of course, then political leaders are responsible of their decision, as I said before. AI, well, still, to summarize and put it simply as much as possible, a very complex issue, I should say that AI is a bit giving the chance to personalize the educational journey. Either we talk of teaching or learning. Is a bit what's happening in health. No, there are a bit some symmetries you can see in these two sectors. I hope and I think that this not one size for all system that the crisis really highlighted as the paradigm needed in education can benefit from an ethic and responsible, inclusive use of AI in the future.
Stefania, thank you so very much for a very enlightening keynote speech. Literally, the sun is rising here in Boston as you finish your remarks. Thank you for giving us this new grammar, this new lexicon to think about the crisis. I could think of no better way to have started this day of reflection and of coming together as this community of graduates of the IEP than with your very, very thoughtful, thought-provoking and sobering remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all of you for waking up so early in that part of the world, and other friends from many regions. Really great. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
Stefania.
bye, Fernando. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Keep in touch.
Felipe, over to you, Felipe. Give us some guidance on what comes next.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So the regional panels for Asia Pacific, MENA, and Sub-Saharan Africa have started now. So I'd invite you to go to our conference webpage. I'll post it right here on our chat. And go to room number 1, 2, or 3, depending on which panel you want to attend. Links are posted on the map, so you just click on top of the room and we'll direct you to the exact panel. Thank you so much for joining today. Please join us in the panels and we'll continue to see you throughout the day.
Let me say one more thing. You're all very welcome to tweet about the conference, but please do not tweet the access page, as this is a conference only for you. So we don't want any interlopers in the conference, but you're most welcome to tweet any insights that you draw or pictures or anything that shares the excitement, okay? All right, I'll see you in the next rooms. Thank you so much. This was great.